The morning Dorothy Covington arrived in Dusk Creek, Texas. She had exactly $1.42 to her name, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and a heart so thoroughly shattered that she was quite certain the pieces would rattle around inside her chest for the rest of her natural life. It was the summer of 1882, and the Santa Fe Railway had deposited her at the edge of the most desolate, sun-scorched stretch of land she had ever seen in her 23 years on this earth. The platform was little more than warped planks nailed together over red dirt, and the station itself was a building that looked as though it had given up on standing upright sometime around 1870 and had simply decided to lean instead. Two old men sat on a bench outside, whittling and paying her absolutely no mind, and a brown dog of indeterminate breed lifted its head to look at her, then thought better of the effort and laid it back down. Dorothy stood there with her carpetbag and her broken heart and squinted into the merciless Texas sun and told herself this was fine. This was entirely fine. She had left Boston with a plan, and the plan had collapsed the moment she stepped off the train in Kansas City to find her cousin Muriel's telegram waiting for her, the one that said Muriel had taken ill with a fever and was sending her regrets but could not take Dorothy in after all. Not right now. Perhaps not ever. The doctors were uncertain about the whole business of ever. She had counted her remaining money standing on the Kansas City platform. Not enough to get back to Boston. Not nearly enough to go forward to San Francisco the way she had vaguely imagined she might, if Muriel could not have her. Enough just barely to get to Dusk Creek, Texas, where a newspaper advertisement had claimed that the Hartwell Hotel was looking for a woman of good character and capable hands to work the front desk and the laundry. So here she was, in Dusk Creek, with $1.42. She picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the town. Dusk Creek was not, by any charitable measure, a thriving metropolis. There was a main street, they called it Cedar Avenue, though there was not a cedar tree in sight, with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a doctor's office whose shingle was so faded you could barely read it, a church at the far end that listed slightly to the left as though it were trying to hear what the saloon was saying, and the Hartwell Hotel, which was 2 stories of whitewashed timber and actually looked like someone had tried, which Dorothy appreciated. She had barely made it 20 feet down Cedar Avenue when she collided, quite literally, with the tall end of a man coming around the corner of the general store at a pace that suggested he was running from something or toward something with equal urgency. The collision sent her carpetbag skidding across the dirt and sent Dorothy herself stumbling backward, and the only thing that kept her from sitting down hard in the red Texas dust was the man's hand, which shot out and caught her elbow with a speed and sureness that spoke of someone accustomed to catching things before they fell. "I am so sorry, ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and rough and genuinely concerned. "That was entirely my fault. I was not looking where I was going." Dorothy steadied herself and looked up at him, because he was considerably taller than she was, tall and lean in the way that men who worked outdoors got lean, not thin but drawn down to the essentials by sun and labor. He had dark hair pushed back under a battered brown hat, a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in several days, and eyes the color of dark honey, amber brown and warm, and presently filled with an expression of honest concern that she was not entirely prepared for. "No harm done," she said, because that was what one said, though her elbow was smarting considerably. He was already retrieving her carpetbag from the dirt, dusting it off with his hat in a gesture that was both unnecessary and oddly touching. He handed it back to her. "You just arriving?" "I am," she said. "I am looking for the Hartwell Hotel." He pointed down the street with one long finger. "Third building on the left. Can't miss it, it's the only one in town that has window boxes." He paused. "The flowers are mostly dead, but the boxes are still there." "Thank you," she said. "Are you the woman from the advertisement?" he asked, and then seemed to realize that was perhaps too presumptuous a question to ask a stranger and added quickly, I only ask because the hotel has been advertising for some time and Frank Hartwell is getting somewhat desperate. I am Dorothy Covington, she said. And yes, he touched the brim of his hat. Levi Atkins, he said. Welcome to Dust Creek, Miss Covington. I hope it treats you better than it looks. He said it with such dry good humor that she laughed before she quite intended to. A short surprised laugh that she immediately felt strange about, given that she had not laughed at anything in 3 weeks. He smiled at the sound of it, not broadly, not in a way that called attention to itself, just a small warming around the eyes and mouth that was somehow more genuine for its quietness. Then he put his hat back on and stepped around her and continued down the street at that same urgent pace, and Dorothy watched him go for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she squared her shoulders and walked toward the Hartwell Hotel and its dead flowers. Frank Hartwell was a stout, red-faced man of 50 who sweated through his shirts regardless of the temperature, and who appeared, upon first meeting, to be deeply suspicious of everything. He looked Dorothy up and down when she introduced herself, read the brief letter of reference she had brought from her former employer in Boston. She had worked for 2 years as a bookkeeper for a textile merchant before the merchant had died, and his unpleasant son had decided the business needed no bookkeeper and certainly not a female one. And then he sniffed and said the pay was $7 a month with a room included, and she could start immediately. The room was small and hot and looked out over the alley behind the hotel, where someone kept 3 chickens that were not laying eggs to anyone's satisfaction. But it had a real bed and a washstand and a window that opened. And Dorothy sat down on the edge of the mattress and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed and told herself that this was going to be all right. She had been in Dust Creek for exactly 4 days when she understood that the town, small as it was, had its own complete and complicated life, the way all small places do. There was Frank Hartwell and his wife Edna, who ran the hotel and who were, beneath their various rough surfaces, basically decent people. There was Doc Hensley, who drank too much but was nonetheless the best option anyone in Dust Creek had when it came to not dying of simple infections. There was a woman named Pearl who ran the general store with iron efficiency and extended credit to half the town, and kept a mental accounting of every cent that she appeared to consider a sacred duty. There was Reverend Marsh at the listing church, who delivered his sermons with such enthusiasm that the building listed a little more each Sunday. And there was the cattle ranching community that surrounded the town on all sides, the working cowboys and ranch hands who came in on weekends and on paydays, rough and dusty and generally harmless, who kept the Broken Spur in business and Pearl's general store in inventory. Levi Atkins, Dorothy learned from Edna Hartwell during a long afternoon of linen folding, was a ranch hand out at the Caldwell Spread, which was 3 miles east of town. He had been in Dust Creek for about 2 years, having come down from Wyoming after some unspecified trouble that Edna described only as a difficulty, with the tone of someone who had enormous respect for other people's private difficulties. "He is a good man," Edna said firmly, snapping a pillowcase with authority. "There are not so many of those that you should overlook one when you find him." Dorothy folded a sheet and said nothing. She saw Levi Atkins again the following Saturday, when a group of the Caldwell ranch hands came into town. He was with 3 other men, and they came into the hotel for a midday meal, because the Hartwell Hotel served a simple table on weekends, and Dorothy was helping Edna carry out plates of salt pork and cornbread when she came around the corner and found him sitting at the long table in the dining room. He looked up when she came in, and there was that same small warming around his eyes, that same recognition that seemed to say something without words. "Miss Covington," he said. "Mr. Atkins," she said, and set his plate down in front of him and went back for the next one. The other ranch hands were loud and cheerful, and made a great deal of noise eating their food, and telling stories about a steer that had apparently done something remarkable involving a fence and 3 acres of creek bottom, and Dorothy went back and forth from the kitchen and tried not to notice that every time she came back into the room, Levi Atkins was watching her, not in a rude way, not in the way that some of the other men looked at women as though they were calculating something, but in a quiet, wondering way, as though she were a problem he was genuinely interested in trying to understand. After the meal, when the other men had gone back out to the street, he lingered at the table with his coffee cup in his hands and said, "How are you finding Dust Creek, Miss Covington?" "I am finding it honest," she said, collecting plates, "which is more than I can say for some places I have been." "That is a generous thing to say about it," he said. "Most people find it plain." "Plain is not a criticism," she said. He considered this seriously. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose it is not." She looked at him then directly, and he held her gaze without flinching or looking away, and something passed between them in that moment that was not yet anything she could name, but that she felt in the very back of her sternum, a small warm pressure like a hand pressed flat against a door. September came in on a hot, dry wind, and the town settled into its rhythms, and Dorothy settled into hers. She learned where everything was and who needed what and how the hotel ran. She kept Frank Hartwell's books, which were in a state of heroic disorganization, and straightened them out with a methodical thoroughness that made Frank look at her with the first genuine admiration she had seen him express about anything except his own opinions. Levi came into town most weekends, and often on some pretext or another during the week. He needed something from Pearl's store. He was bringing a message for Doc Hensley from the Caldwell Ranch. He had some errand or other that brought him down Cedar Avenue and past the Hartwell Hotel at a time when Dorothy might conceivably be out front watering the window boxes, which she had taken it upon herself to revive. The flowers were coming back, slowly, stubbornly, in the way that living things come back when someone pays them enough attention. "You are making a real effort with those," he said one afternoon, stopping on the sidewalk below where she stood on the second-floor gallery tipping a tin watering can over a box of struggling petunias. "They were not dead," she said. "They were only very dry." He squinted up at her. "There is a metaphor in there somewhere, I imagine." She looked down at him. He was wearing his work clothes, canvas trousers, a faded blue shirt, his battered brown hat, and he had clearly come in directly from the range because he was covered in the particular fine dust that clung to everything out here, but he was smiling up at her with that quiet smile, and she felt that door pressure in her chest again, warmer now. "How are things at the Caldwell spread?" she asked. "Moving cattle," he said. "Always moving cattle. Mr. Caldwell believes that cattle must be moved at all times or they will somehow forget what they are." Dorothy laughed. "And what do you believe?" "I believe cattle are exactly where they are," he said, "and would prefer to be left to figure it out themselves." He paused, "which is possibly why I am better at some things than I am at ranching." "What are you better at?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "Horses," he said at last. "I am very good with horses, and I can fix most things that are broken if you give me enough time and the right materials." There was something in the simple directness of this, no boasting, no false modesty, just a plain account of himself, that she found almost unexpectedly affecting. "That sounds like a useful combination," she said. "I have tried to make it so," he said, and there was something quiet and serious underneath the words that she filed away, the way she filed away everything about him. In some interior place, she was only beginning to understand she had specifically designated for this purpose. October brought the beginning of the cattle drive season's end, and with it, a general atmosphere of finality and reckoning that settled over the whole region. Men who had been working ranches all summer began to drift toward decisions, stay on through winter on reduced wages, or take their pay and head somewhere else. The Caldwell Ranch, Dorothy heard from Edna, was not a generous outfit in the cold months. She was keeping the hotel's books late on a Thursday evening when she heard someone at the front desk and came out to find Levi standing there, hat in hands, looking, and this was new and alarming, uncertain. "Mr. Atkins," she said, "can I help you?" "I wondered," he said, and then stopped. He looked at the hat in his hands and then back up at her. I wondered if you might want to walk with me just down the street. It's a fine evening." It was, in fact, a beautiful evening. The temperature had finally broken, and the air had that clarity that came only a few times a year to this part of Texas, when you could see every star, and the sky looked like someone had thrown a handful of silver dust across black silk. "Let me get my shawl," she said. They walked down Cedar Avenue and out past the edge of town to where the land opened up, flat and vast and breathing. She had not been out of the town proper after dark before, and the size of the sky stopped her. She just stood there looking up at it. "I forget," she said. "I forget how much of it there is." "I never forget," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "It is the thing I like best about this country. No matter what is wrong, the sky is always that big." She looked at him sideways. He was standing beside her looking up, and in the dark she could see the lines of his face, the set jaw, the straight nose, the long throat, and she felt something move in her that was not the small, warm pressure anymore, but something more significant, something that made her catch her breath. "What was wrong?" she asked. "In Wyoming." He was quiet for a moment. She did not think he was going to answer. "My partner," he said at last. "My ranching partner. We had a small operation going. He was not honest about the money, about any of it really." He paused. "I trusted him a good deal more than he deserved." "I am sorry," she said. "What about Boston?" he asked, and she understood that he was offering her equal terms, equal honesty, and she appreciated that enough to give it back. "A man," she said. "I trusted him a good deal more than he deserved." He was quiet, receiving this. He did not press for details, and he did not offer pity, which were exactly the two right responses. "Well," he said at last, "here we both are." "Here we both are," she agreed. They walked back to town in a silence that was comfortable and close, and at the door of the hotel he touched the brim of his hat and said good night, and she said good night, and she went inside and stood in the small hot room behind the front desk for a long moment with her hands pressed flat against the counter, and her heart doing something irregular and complicated. She wrote a letter to her sister Clara in Boston that night. Clara was 4 years older and significantly more pragmatic, and had a husband and 3 children and a house in Cambridge, and was the nearest thing Dorothy had to an anchor in the world. She did not mention Levi Atkins in the letter. Then she crossed it out and rewrote the letter and mentioned him only briefly, as a ranch hand she had met, a person she had encountered, someone she had spoken to. And then she read it back, and the brief mention took up nearly a full page, and she folded the letter with a firm hand and sealed it and told herself she was being ridiculous. November came, and with it the cold, and with the cold came the news that was going to reshape everything, though Dorothy did not know it yet when she was simply listening to Frank Hartwell tell it at the breakfast table. The news was this. A land development company out of Dallas had bought up the old Crane property on the south end of town, and there were plans, real plans, with surveyors and a representative who had come through in October, to extend the railway line through Dust Creek and establish a proper depot. The town, which had been a fine if modest station on the existing line, was going to become a junction, which meant growth, which meant that Dust Creek, sleepy and listing and beloved in its rough way, was about to change. Frank Hartwell was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of news that made men like Frank think about expansion. Dorothy was less certain about it. Change was not always growth, and growth was not always improvement, and she had seen what happened to small places when outside money arrived with intentions. She talked to Levi about it one Sunday when he came in for the midday meal and stayed afterward, which had become a pattern that no one commented on because Edna Hartwell was deeply satisfied with herself for orchestrating it, though she had not, in fact, done anything except make sure the coffee pot was always full. "What do you think about the railway expansion?" Dorothy asked. He leaned back in his chair and turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was a thing he did when he was thinking. "I think it will bring money," he said. "And where money goes, things get complicated. The Caldwell Ranch is already talking about what it means for cattle prices if you can ship direct from here instead of driving south." He paused. "It will be good for some people." And not for others, Dorothy said. That is usually how it goes, he said. He looked at her. Are you worried about it, about the hotel? Frank is not worried about the hotel, she said. Frank is thinking about adding a third floor. What are you worried about? He asked, and the directness of it, the willingness to ask her the actual question, the one underneath the one she had been circling, landed on her with a weight she had not expected. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, mirroring him without realizing it. I am worried, she said carefully, about getting comfortable in a place and then finding that the place has changed into something else. He was very quiet for a moment. That is a reasonable worry, he said, for someone who has already been through that once. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that amber-brown attention, steady and warm, and she felt the weight of being truly seen by someone really seen, not looked at, not evaluated or assessed or found wanting or found useful, but seen as something that went through her from crown to soul. Levi, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and she had not entirely planned to, and she felt her face warm. He did not make anything of it. He simply said, Dorothy, in return, quietly, as though he had been waiting for permission. I think I would like to stay here, she said. In Dusk Creek. I think I would like this to be where I am. I am very glad to hear that, he said, and his voice was low and careful with the emotion in it, the way you carry something full to the brim and move slowly so it does not spill. December settled over Dusk Creek with an unusual ferocity. The cold that came down from the panhandle was the kind that got into your bones and stayed there, and the wood stoves in every building worked hard all day and night. The Hartwell Hotel was full for the first time in years, men coming in for the railway surveying work, a few families investigating the prospects of the newly promising town, a land agent from Dallas who wore good boots and talked too much. Dorothy was busy from before dawn until after dark, and she did not mind it. There was a rightness to being busy, to having things to do that needed doing and doing them well. She and Edna had established a friendship by this point, the kind that develops between women who work alongside each other day after day and discover they agree on the things that matter and can tolerate each other's opinions on the things they do not. It was Edna who told her, carefully and with the gentleness of genuine concern, about the letter. The letter had come from Boston. It was addressed to Dorothy and it had arrived on a Thursday morning. And when Dorothy opened it in the small room behind the front desk, she had to read it twice before she understood what it said. The man she had left Boston over, his name was Charles Alderman, and he had been a very persuasive liar about several things including his existing wife, had apparently died of a sudden fever in October. His actual wife, a woman named Frances, had taken it upon herself to write to Dorothy out of what she described as a sense of Christian obligation and practical necessity. Because Charles had died in debt, and some of that debt, it turned out, involved Dorothy's family. Her father, who had been taken in by Charles's very persuasive lying just as Dorothy had cautioned a note against the family house in Lowell. The note was coming due. There was no money to cover it. Dorothy sat with this letter in her hands for a long time. Outside the window, the 3 chickens made their discontented noises in the alley, and a wagon went past on Cedar Avenue, and somewhere down the street someone was hammering something related to the railway expansion. She thought about her father. Arthur Covington was 61 years old and had worked his whole life in the Lowell textile mills and had bought that house in 1861 and had paid it off with 20 years of careful saving, and had then, in 1881, been persuaded by a charming and dishonest man to sign his name to something he should not have signed. The amount was $140. It was due in February. Dorothy had $18 saved from her wages at the Hartwell Hotel, and she had been sending $5 a month home to her parents because her mother's health was not good. She had $18 and the note was $140. She went to Frank Hartwell and asked if she could have an advance on her wages. Frank was sympathetic in his frank way, which meant he was simultaneously genuinely sorry about her situation and absolutely certain that advancing wages was a practice that led directly to moral and financial ruin. He offered to advance her $10. She thanked him and took it. She had $28. She did not sleep that night. The next morning she sat down with Frank Hartwell's books. Her books now, really, because she had been keeping them for months and understood them as well as anyone could understand the financial life of a moderately successful small hotel. And she worked through the numbers with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and the numbers were clear and unambiguous. She could not come up with $140 before February, unless she left. Unless she went somewhere with more opportunity. San Francisco, Denver, a city where the wages for someone who could keep books were higher, and where she might find work that paid enough in a short enough time. Unless she went east, back toward Boston, and tried to find some solution on the ground. She had $1.42 in her pocket that was not the advance from Frank, because she had separated her personal savings from the advance by habit and necessity, the $1.42 being what she thought of as her absolute floor, the last of anything, the number below which she was truly without resources. She needed a train ticket. She needed to go somewhere and find more money than she had here, and she needed to do it before February. She was standing on the hotel's front gallery the following morning with her shawl wrapped around her and her mind running the numbers for the 100th time when Levi rode into town on his horse, a big roan called Patience, and saw her face. He pulled up at the hitching post and swung down and said, "What has happened?" she told him. All of it, clearly and without drama, the way you tell the truth when the truth is complex and you want to be understood rather than pitied. She told him about Charles Alderman and the wife she had not known about and the debt in her father's house and the $140 in February and the numbers that did not add up. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his hat in his hands, his expression steady and attentive. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I need to go somewhere," she said. "I need to go somewhere I can earn enough money quickly enough to send it home. I have been thinking Denver. There are businesses there, larger establishments, the wages are higher." She looked at him directly. "I need a train ticket." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the ground and turning his hat in his hands, and she could see him thinking. The careful, methodical thinking of a man who has had to solve problems with very limited resources for a very long time. "Much is the ticket to Denver," he said. "From here on the Santa Fe," she said. $1. He was still for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced his wallet, which was a worn leather thing that had seen better decades, and he opened it and took out the single dollar bill inside it and held it out to her. "Levi," she said, "I cannot take that." "It is yours if you want it," he said, and his voice was very steady and very quiet. "That is everything you have," she said. She knew it was. She could see the empty wallet. "I am paid on Friday," he said. "I will manage between now and Friday." "Levi, Dorothy," he met her eyes. His were warm and direct and held something in them that was enormous and careful at once. "Take the ticket. Go sort out your family's business. Come back." The last two words landed in the space between them like a stone into still water. "Come back." She took the dollar. Her hand was not quite steady when she reached for it, and his was, and their fingers touched for just a moment in the exchange, brief and warm, and she thought she might have to sit down. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me," he said. He put his hat on. "When is the next train?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. 7 o'clock, he nodded. "I will be here," he said. She went inside and she sat with the dollar in her palm and she thought about Denver and $140 in February and her father's house in Lowell. And she thought about Levi Atkins standing in the cold morning with his empty wallet and his steady eyes and his last dollar in his hand. And she thought about two words: come back. She sat there for a long time. And then she did something she had not planned to do when she sat down. She got up and got her coat and walked down Cedar Avenue to the telegraph office, which was a small room attached to the rear of the general store, and she sent a telegram to her sister Clara in Boston. The telegram said, "Father's debt $140 due February. Telegraph any news. Can you manage any portion? Dorothy." Then she walked back to the hotel and picked up the $1 bill, and she held it, and she thought about what was possible and what was right and what she knew about herself that she had not quite known before she came to Dusk Creek. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in her small hot room and listened to the chickens and the wind, and thought about everything she knew and everything she did not know. At 6 in the morning she was dressed and had her carpetbag packed. The clasp was still broken. She had tied it with a length of cord, and she walked down to the station. Levi was already there. He was leaning against the station building with his arms folded and his hat pulled low against the cold, and he straightened when he saw her come around the corner with her carpetbag. "You are early," he said. "So are you," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was sharp and clear, and the sky in the east was beginning to lighten from black to the particular deep blue that came just before sunrise. She reached into her coat pocket and took out his dollar and held it out to him. He looked at it, he looked at her. "Dorothy," he said. "I am not going," she said. The silence that followed was very complete. "Clara telegraphed back last night," she said. "She has $40 she can spare, and her husband Garrison can speak to the bank about a payment extension. It is not the whole solution, but it is the beginning of one." She took a breath. "And I have $28. And between us that is $68, which is not 140, but it is enough for the bank to take seriously. And Clara's husband is a lawyer. And Dorothy," he said. "I cannot leave," she said, and her voice broke a little on it, just at the edge, just enough that she heard it. "I cannot leave this place. I cannot leave," she stopped. She looked at him directly. "I cannot leave you," she said. "I have been sitting in that room all night trying to convince myself that I can and I cannot, and I am sorry if that is inconvenient or inappropriate, but I cannot go without saying it because I have been quite honest with you about everything else." He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, and his hands came up and cupped her face, and he looked at her for one long, unguarded moment, and then he bent his head and kissed her. And it was nothing like the kisses she had known before, nothing careful or calculating or pointed toward some ulterior purpose. It was just completely and entirely him, warm and present and genuine. And she closed her eyes and felt the cold morning air and his warm hands and thought that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He pulled back and looked at her. His eyes were very bright in the early light. "I have been trying to figure out how to tell you something for 2 months, he said. "Tell me now," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since you laughed at something I said when I had not made anyone laugh in a very long time. And I have not known what to do about it because I did not want to presume and I did not want to frighten you and I did not think I had the right." "You have the right," she said. "You have had it for some time, you were only not aware of it." He laughed, a real laugh, sudden and surprised and warm, and she stood up on her toes and kissed him again. And behind them the sun came fully over the horizon and turned the whole world gold. She gave him back his dollar. He took it and looked at it in his palm and then looked at her. "You are staying," he said. "I am staying," she said. The problem of the $140 did not resolve itself easily or all at once, because real problems rarely do, and this story has the advantage of being honest. But it resolved. Clara and Garrison Reed dealt with the bank in Boston on behalf of Arthur Covington with the $40 Clara had, and the firm presence of a lawyer who knew what he was doing, and a proposed payment schedule. Dorothy sent every dollar she could spare over the following 3 months. Pearl at the general store, who had by this time developed a considerable respect for Dorothy's intelligence and practicality, offered her additional work keeping the store's accounts, which added $2 a month. Frank Hartwell, in a moment of generosity that surprised everyone including himself, gave her a raise to $9 a month on the grounds that she had done more for the hotel than he was paying her for. By April of 1883, the debt was cleared. Arthur Covington's house in Lowell was safe. Dorothy Covington sat at the desk in the Hartwell Hotel on the evening she received her sister's confirming letter and felt something release in her chest that she had not realized was clenched. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed and thought about her father in that house in Lowell and thought, "Good, good, it is done." She was still sitting there when Levi came in, which he did most evenings now, without embarrassment or pretense, because the whole of Dust Creek had understood what was happening between them for months and had adjusted accordingly, as small communities do. He sat down across from her and looked at her face and said, "Good news." "The debt is cleared," she said. "My father's house is safe." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that in the quiet of the hotel lobby for a long, warm moment while the evening wind came under the door and the lamp on the desk burned steady and low. "I have something to tell you," he said. She looked at him. She had come to understand over these months, a man who came to important things slowly and carefully, turning them in his mind the way he turned his hat in his hands, from every angle until he was sure. She had learned to wait for him to be ready and found that what he said when he finally said it was almost always worth waiting for. "Bill Caldwell offered me a different position," he said. "Not ranch hand, foreman of the horse operation. It pays $15 a month." He paused. "And there is a small house that goes with it, on the property. It is not much of a house." Dorothy's heart was doing the irregular, complicated thing again. "Levi," she said. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were warm and he was looking at her the way he had always looked at her, as though she were a problem he genuinely wanted to understand and had been working on for a long time and was glad of the work. "I am asking you to marry me and live in a house that is not much of a house and be with me in this place that is plain and honest, and I know you love it as much as I do." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Boston and Charles Alderman and the things she had believed about herself before she came here, the things she had believed about love, that it was something that happened to you before you understood it, that by the time you knew it was real it was already too late to be careful, that it was a kind of wound. She thought about what she knew now, which was different. Love, she now understood, could also be something you walked toward slowly, in broad daylight with your eyes open, and it could still be enormous and true. "It sounds," she said, "like more than enough of a house." They were married in June of 1883, in the Listing Church at the end of Cedar Avenue, on a morning when the whole of Dust Creek seemed to have turned out, which was not difficult given the town's population, but was no less meaningful for that. Reverend Marsh delivered a sermon of such enthusiastic warmth that the church shivered with it. Pearl wept openly and made no apology. Edna Hartwell produced a cake that was a genuine achievement, and Frank Hartwell made a speech that was mercifully short. Dorothy wore a dress she and Edna had made together from blue calico that matched neither the fashion of Boston nor the practicality of the frontier, and was exactly right. Levi wore his cleanest shirt and his least battered hat, and looked at her when she came up the aisle as though she were the most remarkable thing he had ever seen, and she looked back at him the same way, and Reverend Marsh had to clear his throat twice before either of them remembered where they were. The house on the Caldwell property was, as Levi had promised, not much of a house. It was 3 rooms with a stone fireplace that drew beautifully, and a porch that looked east toward the sunrise, and a root cellar that was actually in excellent condition, which was, Levi said, the thing that mattered most in the long run. Dorothy Atkins. She wrote the name on the first letter she sent from the house and looked at it for a long moment, agreed about the root cellar, and set about making everything else into something. She planted a garden. Not flowers only, though she planted those too, petunias and black-eyed Susans and a determined stand of hollyhocks along the south wall, but a real kitchen garden with tomatoes and squash and sweet potatoes and herbs, because the soil in this part of Texas was hard and capricious but not impossible, and Dorothy had learned something important about things that were hard and capricious, and not impossible. She continued keeping the books for the Hartwell Hotel, because Frank could not manage without her, and she liked the work, and it gave her a connection to the town that she valued. She also began, quietly and without particularly advertising it, to help other people in the area with their accounts. The blacksmith, whose books were in a state that made Frank Hartwell's look well organized by comparison, and a newly arrived family named the Garcias who had taken up the old Morrison farm and were setting up a small operation growing corn and melons. She liked the Garcias enormously. Elena Garcia was a woman of tremendous energy and extremely good humor, and her husband Roberto was a quiet man who could fix almost anything mechanical, which meant that he and Levi had an immediate and productive friendship that Dorothy watched with satisfaction. The railway expansion progressed through that year. By the fall of 1883, there were 3 times as many people in Dust Creek as there had been when Dorothy arrived, and by the following spring there were twice that many again. New buildings went up. A second saloon appeared, which Reverend Marsh declared a sign of moral deterioration, and which Frank Hartwell declared competition, both of which were accurate. A school was established, which Dust Creek had not had before, and a proper doctor came to assist Doc Hensley, which was fortunate because Doc Hensley's drinking had been getting worse, and his hands were not as steady as they had been. Dorothy had an opinion on most of the changes in town, and she expressed it clearly when asked and sometimes when not asked, because she had been in Dust Creek long enough to feel the responsibility of having a stake in it. She sat on the planning committee that was established to manage the railway expansion's impact. She helped organize the building committee for the new school. She wrote a letter to the Dallas newspaper, a carefully argued, precisely worded letter, about the way the land development company had been buying up property from families who did not fully understand what they were signing, a situation she recognized with personal clarity, and the letter was printed and generated a response, and some of the transactions were reviewed, not all of them but some, and she considered that a beginning. The injustice of it was not a small thing. She had seen it clearly from the moment the land agent in his good boots had started talking about opportunity and growth, had seen how the language of opportunity and growth had been used against people before, had seen it used against her own father, had seen it used against the Garcia family's neighbors who had been offered 40 cents on the dollar for their land, and had not known to say that was wrong. She said what she knew clearly and where it could be heard, and she kept saying it, and Levi was proud of her for it in the quiet, fierce way that he was proud of her for most things, which was to say he told her so directly and without decoration, and meant every word. In the spring of 1884, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she was certain, and she spent those 2 weeks in a state of interior revolution, joy and terror and wonder and more joy, circling each other like horses on a lead line. She told Levi on a Sunday morning on the porch, with the sunrise coming up in its gold and rose, and she watched his face go through everything at once surprise and understanding, and then a warmth so profound it was almost a physical thing, like standing near a fire. He sat very still for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand and held it in both of his, and she felt him trembling slightly, just slightly, the way a person trembles when they are containing something enormous. "Dorothy," he said, and nothing else was needed. Their son was born on a November morning in 1884, attended by the new doctor whose name was Calloway, and by Edna Hartwell, who positioned herself in the room with the authority of someone who has attended a great many births and knows what is required, and is not going to move regardless of what anyone says. He was born squalling and red and perfect, and Dorothy held him in the pale morning light and looked at his face, the face of someone entirely new, entirely himself, with Levi's dark hair and the determined mouth that she would later come to understand was entirely his own, and felt something settle in her that she had not known was unsettled. They named him Arthur James Atkins. Arthur for her father and James for Levi's, who had died in Wyoming before Levi came south, and who was spoken of with a quiet reverence that told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man James Atkins had been. Levi held his son for the first time with the careful precision of someone holding something invaluable, his big, capable hands impossibly tender, and he looked at Dorothy over the baby's head with everything he had ever felt about anything in his face, unguarded and complete. "Thank you," he said. It was not the only thing he meant. "You are thanking the wrong person," she said, exhausted and warm. "Thank the actual labor that was performed." He laughed, startled, and the baby opened his eyes at the sound of it, dark and unfocused and new, and they both looked at him and forgot every other thing in the world for a moment. Arthur Atkins was a good baby in the sense that he was healthy and curious and had opinions, which he expressed loudly and at length. He was also a child who seemed, from the very beginning, to have inherited the particular combination of his father's steadiness and his mother's absolute certainty that if something needed to be done, it should be done properly and right now. He did not crawl. He pulled himself to standing at 7 months and stood there looking around as though he were taking inventory and found the house adequate but had some suggestions. Levi watched his son with a delight that he showed only in small ways, but that was enormous. He built Arthur a proper cradle with wood he had cut and planed himself, with a rocker so smooth it barely made a sound, and he built it with the same careful attention he brought to everything that needed making. He taught the boy to sit a horse, a very small and very gentle horse borrowed from the Caldwell stable, when Arthur was 3, with a patience and gentleness that Dorothy watched from the fence with her arms folded, and her heart so full she was not sure where to put it. By 1886, Dusk Creek was a genuinely different place than the town Dorothy had arrived in 4 years earlier. It was larger and busier, and the railway was fully operational, and there were new families and new businesses, and a real school with a real school teacher and a second church. This one Baptist and considerably more structurally sound than Reverend Marsh's Episcopal effort, which continued to list but which continued to stand, out of what Levi said was stubbornness, and what Reverend Marsh said was faith, and what Dorothy suspected was a combination of both. Pearl's General Store had expanded into the building next door. The Hartwell Hotel had added that 3rd floor Frank had always wanted, and Dorothy had helped design the bookkeeping system that kept the expanded operation organized, because Frank Hartwell was deeply persuaded of his own organizational abilities and deeply wrong about them, and needed someone to save him from himself on a regular basis. Levi had proven himself so indispensable to Caldwell's horse operation that Bill Caldwell, who was a practical man if not always a generous one, had increased his wages to $20 a month and offered him a partnership stake in the horse breeding aspect of the business, which Levi had accepted with the careful due diligence of a man who had been badly burned by a partnership once and intended never to be burned again. He had read the agreement 3 times and shown it to Dorothy, who read it twice more, and between them they were satisfied. It was a good life. It was a real, true, good life, and Dorothy was aware of this, not with the anxious gratitude of someone who is afraid it will be taken away, but with the steady warmth of someone who has worked for something and knows it is built on solid ground. They had arguments, because they were 2 people with strong opinions and full lives, and their arguments were the kind that real people have about money and time, and whose responsibility something was, and whether Arthur should be permitted to spend so much time in the stable at the expense of his lessons. And they resolved them with the same straightforwardness they brought to everything, which was to say directly and honestly, and without retreating into silence or cruelty. And after each one, Dorothy felt more certain of the thing they had built together, not less. She wrote to Clara regularly, and the 2 of them had a correspondence that was one of the great pleasures of Dorothy's life, full of the details of 2 women's existence in very different places, full of the kind of honest friendship that only works between people who tell each other the truth. Clara's husband Garrison visited in the summer of 1886 with Clara and their youngest daughter, a visit that was significant in numerous ways, not least because it resulted in Clara standing on the porch of the house on the Caldwell property looking out at the flat golden land and the enormous sky and saying, "Dorothy, I understand now. I truly do." Her father Arthur had come the year before, alone because Dorothy's mother was too frail for the journey, and Levi had met him at the Dust Creek station with Patience the roan horse and driven him out to the property in the cart. And Dorothy had watched the two of them together over the course of the visit, her cautious, proud, weathered father and her husband, and had seen them find each other, carefully, in the way that men who have both known difficulty and kept going recognize the quality in each other. On the last morning of Arthur Covington's visit, she had found him and Levi sitting on the porch in the early morning with their coffee, talking quietly, and she had stood inside the screen door and listened without making herself known, and her father had said, "She is happy, really happy." And Levi had said, "I know. I intend to keep it that way." And her father had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Good man," in the tone he used for things he meant absolutely and without qualification. Dorothy had gone back to the kitchen and stood very still for a moment and pressed her hands flat on the table and thought about everything that had brought her here, all the wreckage and the wrong roads and the mornings when she had not known where she was going and the $1 and the last dollar and the two words that had changed everything, come back, and she thought, yes, this is where it was always going. In the summer of 1887, Dorothy found herself pregnant again. She told Levi in the kitchen this time, across the table over coffee, and he looked up at her and smiled a real full smile, not the small warming she had first fallen in love with but the whole thing, broad and unguarded and brilliant, and said, "Arthur is going to be insufferable about this." Arthur was, in fact, 3.5 years old and possessed of extremely firm opinions about his own primacy in the household, so Levi was probably right. "He will adapt," Dorothy said. "He will," Levi agreed. "He is your son." "He is your son," she said. "He has your stubbornness." "My stubbornness," Levi said, "is called persistence when I do it." "It is called stubbornness when anyone does it," Dorothy said. He got up from the table and came around to her and bent down and kissed the top of her head, and she reached up and caught his hand without looking, by feel, by the simple certainty of knowing where he was. Their daughter was born in February of 1888. She arrived in the world in the very early morning, before the sun, and when the light came up, it found her already awake and looking around with the sharp, dark eyes she had inherited from her father, and a disposition that announced itself within the first hour as both determined and curious. They named her Ruth Eleanor Atkins. Ruth because Dorothy had always loved the story of the woman who said, "Where you go, I will go," and Eleanor for Levi's mother, who was still alive in a small town in Wyoming, and who received the news by telegram, and whose reply was a single line that said, "I am very glad and I will come in the spring." Eleanor Atkins did come in the spring. She was a small, thin woman with Levi's eyes and a directness of manner that Dorothy recognized as the source of her husband's, and she and Dorothy understood each other completely within the first hour of the visit and were firm friends within the first day. "He wrote to me about you," Eleanor said, on the second morning when they were sitting on the porch while Levi took Arthur and baby Ruth for a walk, Ruth strapped to his back in a carrier that Elena Garcia had shown them how to make, which was more efficient than any arrangement they had been able to devise themselves, and Arthur stumping along beside his father with great seriousness of purpose. "Did he?" Dorothy said. "He wrote," Eleanor said, "that he had met a woman in Dust Creek who laughed at something he said, and that he had not made anyone laugh in a long time and he did not know what to do about it." She paused, looking out at the land. "I wrote back and told him to start by making her laugh again." Dorothy thought about standing on the gallery of the Hartwell Hotel with her watering can and Levi below on the sidewalk talking about cattle and metaphors, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through her. That was good advice, she said. I have my moments, Alina said. Dusk Creek continued to grow and change through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. The railway brought prosperity and it brought complications, the way prosperity always does. There were disputes about land and water rights and grazing, and the injustices that Dorothy had started writing about in 1883 did not stop happening simply because she wrote about them. But her writing became part of the public record of those injustices, and some of the people she wrote about had to reckon with that. She became, without particularly seeking it, a voice in the town, not a loud voice, not a political voice in the formal sense, because the formal sense did not include women, which she considered a straightforward absurdity but a presence. People came to her. They came with their accounts and their contracts and their letters that needed reading carefully and their situations that required a clear head and an honest assessment. And she gave those things freely and charged for them when the giving was sustainable and declined money when it was not, according to a calculus that was entirely her own and that Levi trusted absolutely. He had become, by the early 1890s, genuinely well established in the horse breeding world of that part of Texas. The partnership with Caldwell was producing results that other ranchers came to observe and purchase, and Levi's reputation for producing horses that were both sound in body and temperament had spread further than Dusk Creek. He was not a wealthy man. The frontier was not generous with that particular outcome to men of his starting position, but he was secure and respected and doing work he was genuinely good at, which he considered, and Dorothy agreed, to be among the greater gifts a person could receive from their working life. Arthur Atkins grew into a boy of serious purpose and occasional dramatic announcement, deeply interested in horses from the age of 3 and in the stars from the age of 7, after a night when his father lay beside him in the pasture and named the constellations one by one until they both fell asleep, and Dorothy came out with a lantern and found them there, and stood looking at them with the lantern in her hand, feeling something so large she could not find a word for it. He was learning everything Levi could teach him about horses and everything Dorothy could teach him about keeping accounts and reading carefully, and what he synthesized from these two educations was an ambition to breed horses and run the business of doing it at the same time, which his parents found both predictable and genuinely exciting. Ruth Alina Atkins was, from the beginning, a force. She was talking in complete sentences at 18 months and asking questions at 2 years that made adults blink. She had her father's coloring and her mother's way with words, and a particular combination of the two that expressed itself as a comprehensive interest in everything and a strong opinion about most of it. She befriended Alina Garcia's daughter Marisol, who was 2 years older than she was, and the two of them were such a force together that Cedar Avenue had learned to pay attention when they appeared. The school in Dusk Creek was good enough for both children through their early years, and Dorothy supplemented it, as she supplemented most things, with books she ordered from the publishing houses in New York and Chicago, because the mail order system was one of the genuine marvels of this era, and she used it without apology. It was 1892 when she sat down with Levi on the porch on a Sunday evening. Arthur was 8 and Ruth was 4, both of them inside and mercifully quiet, and said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. He was the same man he had always been, which is to say he had changed in all the ways that life changes people: deeper lines around his eyes, more silver in his dark hair, the particular quality of ease that comes from a life lived deliberately, and he was completely and entirely himself, which was the thing that had never changed and which she loved most. "I am listening," he said. "I have been thinking about the morning at the station," she said. "The morning I did not get on the train." He was very still, watching her. "I have been thinking about how close I came," she said, "to not being here, to going somewhere else and figuring something else out. And I know how it happened, Clara's telegram and the math of the thing and the fact that I could not leave, but sometimes I think about it and I am—" She paused, finding the word. Astonished. I'm astonished by how close it was and by how completely right it turned out to be to stay. He reached over and took her hand. He held it in his warm, steady grip and looked at her in the evening light. I think about it too, he said. I gave you that dollar and I did not know if it would work. I did not know if you would come back. I only knew that I had to try. He paused. Then you came out to the station with your carpetbag in your face and you gave the dollar back to me and I thought I was going to have to sit down on that platform and collect myself. You seemed very composed, she said. I was not composed, he said. I was performing composure. There is a considerable difference. She laughed and he smiled at the sound of it the way he had always smiled at the sound of it from the very first time. Well, she said, you performed it very convincingly. I had practice, he said. By that point I had been in love with you for 2 months and performing not being alarmed by it. Was it alarming, she said. Extremely, he said. You are an alarming woman, Dorothy Atkins. Is that a criticism? She said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips against her knuckles, deliberate and warm, and looked at her over her own hand with those amber-brown eyes that she had been looking into for nearly 10 years, and that still had the power to make her feel like someone had pressed a warm hand flat against a door in her chest. It is the highest praise I know how to give, he said. The years continue to pass with the particular quality of time in a life that is genuinely happy, quickly in the living, and richly in the remembering. The town of Dust Creek expanded and contracted and found its level. The railway brought what it brought and took what it took. And the family on the Caldwell property, which was no longer solely the Caldwell property, because Levi's partnership stake had grown through the years to a genuine ownership share in the horse breeding operation, and the operation itself had become something Bill Caldwell's son Edgar, who had taken over after Bill's death in 1891. Referred to as the Caldwell-Atkins establishment, put down roots of the kind that go very deep. The house that was not much of a house had become more of a house over the years. Not grand, never grand. That was not what either of them wanted, but real and solid and full of the accumulated particulars of a life deliberately lived. Bookshelves on every wall. A kitchen garden that Dorothy had expanded twice. A porch that looked east toward the sunrise where she had sat every morning for 10 years with her coffee and watched the light change across the flat golden land. Alone when Levi was out early, and with him when he was not. The hollyhocks along the south wall had gone entirely feral and magnificent, and were now a stand taller than the window. In 1894, Arthur was 10 and had already decided, with the completeness of certainty that 10-year-olds are capable of, that he was going to breed horses and run the books, and that these two things together were one thing and not two. He spent his days between the stable and the kitchen table, where Dorothy kept the business accounts, moving between them with the ease of someone who has found his purpose early and is grateful for it. Ruth was 6 and reading novels that were meant for people considerably older than 6, and her friendship with Marisol Garcia was the organizing principle of her social existence, and she had recently developed a passionate interest in geology, which her father encouraged by bringing her interesting rocks from the rangeland, and which her mother encouraged by ordering a basic geology text from a publisher in New York, and which Reverend Marsh, who was still at the listing church and showed no signs of stopping, declared to be a fine example of a young woman taking the world seriously, which Ruth received as the highest possible praise. Dorothy's mother had died in the spring of 1893, which was a grief Dorothy carried with the quiet steadiness of someone who has made their peace with the fact that some losses are complete and do not resolve into anything other than what they are. Her father Arthur was still in the Lowell house, older now and slower, and there had been a discussion, more than one, serious discussions, about whether he should come west. He resisted it, with the tenacity of a man for whom a house is not simply a building, but the accumulated weight of an entire life, and Dorothy understood this completely and did not push. But she wrote to him twice a week and told him everything, and he wrote back in his careful, slightly old-fashioned hand and told her everything on his end. And between the letters the distance was manageable, which is what you did when you could not eliminate a distance. You made it manageable. On a September evening in 1895, Dorothy was sitting on the porch with the last of the light going gold across the grass, and the sound of supper being prepared inside. Levi had taken it on himself to make supper on Sunday evenings, a habit that had started during her second pregnancy when she was tired all the time, and had never stopped because it turned out he was genuinely good at it, and because she loved sitting on the porch in the Sunday evening light. And she was thinking about nothing in particular, or rather about everything at once in that loose, comfortable way that is one of the privileges of genuine contentment. Levi came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her, and handed her one, and they sat in the quiet together. Across the pasture the horses moved in the falling light, the mares and the young stock and Patience the roan, who was old now but still moving, still here, which Levi considered a personal loyalty on the horse's part, and which Dorothy considered a testament to good care. "Arthur told me today," Levi said, "that he wants to go to the agricultural college in College Station when he is old enough." Dorothy turned to look at him. "He told me that too, last week." "Did he tell you that he has been reading the college's curriculum?" Levi said. "He has been reading it for 6 months," Dorothy said. "I ordered it for him." Levi looked at her. "You ordered it for him?" "He asked for it," she said. "He wrote away for it himself and then told me it was coming so I would not be confused by the post." Levi was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, and it was his real laugh, the one she had first heard at the station all those years ago, startled and warm. "He is 12 years old. He is very organized," Dorothy said. "He gets that from me." "He gets the horse part from me," Levi said. "He gets the stubbornness from both of us," she said. Levi conceded this with a nod. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was still what he did when he was thinking, and she watched him with the same attention she had always brought to him, unchanged and unchanging. "Are you happy?" he said. It was not a question he asked often. He asked it the way he asked all direct questions, simply, without preamble, meaning exactly what he said. She looked at him, and at the land, and at the horses in the long gold light, and she thought about Boston and Dust Creek and a broken carpetbag, and a watering can, and a dollar bill pressed into her hand by someone who had nothing left and gave it anyway. "Levi Atkins," she said, "I'm the most thoroughly and completely happy woman in the state of Texas." He smiled. Not the small warming, though that was there too. It was always there, but the whole thing, broad and unguarded, the smile she had seen for the first time at the station on a cold morning in December 1882, and had been fortunate enough to see 10,000 times since. "Good," he said, and reached over and took her hand. They sat like that as the light went, as the horses settled, as the sounds from inside the house shifted from the comfortable noise of supper being finished to the comfortable noise of children winding toward sleep, Ruth's voice rising in some argument and Arthur's lower voice responding, and the screen door banging once and then quiet. The stars came out one by one, the way they always did out here, in this enormous sky, and Dorothy leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and felt the familiar warmth of him and thought about the biggest sky she had ever seen and a man who had said it was the thing he loved best about this country and who had been wrong, she thought, about what the best thing was, because the best thing she knew now was not the sky. The best thing was this. Exactly this. The years that followed were good years. Arthur went to the agricultural college in College Station, as he had planned since he was 12, and came back at 21 with a degree, and a young woman named Caroline, who was from a farming family near Waco, and who had a quick mind and good humor, and who Dorothy loved from the first evening. They sat together in the kitchen on the Caldwell Atkins property, going over the breeding records, and discussing the business with the complete ease of 2 people who spoke the same language. Arthur and Caroline married in the spring of 1904 and settled in a house on the property, because the operation had grown large enough that it made sense for Arthur to be there full time. and because Arthur had never quite been able to imagine being anywhere else, which was something he told Dorothy one evening with a slightly sheepish certainty, and which she received with a warmth that she hoped he understood. Their first child, Arthur and Caroline's, was a boy they named James, and Dorothy held her grandson in the parlor of the house that was no longer not much of a house, and felt something complete in a way that she had not known was incomplete. Ruth had gone east. Not to Boston, to Philadelphia, where she studied at a women's college and came back changed in the ways that education changes people, which is to say she came back more herself than ever, with a geology degree and a position at a natural history institution that was working to document the rock formations of the Southwest, which brought her back to Texas regularly enough that her absence was not an absence in the full sense. She brought home, in 1903, a man named Thomas Beaumont, who was a surveyor for the same institution, and who was thoughtful and quiet and looked at Ruth with the exact specific quality of attention that Dorothy recognized, because she had first seen it in a man's eyes more than 20 years ago and had known then what it meant. She and Levi sat on the porch after Thomas and Ruth had gone inside for the evening, and she said, "He loves her," and Levi said, "I can see that." And they were quiet for a comfortable moment, and then Levi said, "She is going to say yes before he asks," and Dorothy said, "She already has," and Levi looked at her and she looked back at him, and they both knew this was exactly how it was supposed to go. Thomas and Ruth were married in the fall of 1903, in the Listing Church, which had been reinforced 3 times and which Reverend Marsh, now very old and very much still there, declared indestructible by anything less than the wrath of God, which he seemed to consider unlikely under the circumstances. Pearl retired the year after and turned the general store over to her nephew, who ran it with reasonable competence and none of his aunt's iron authority, and Pearl herself sat on the porch of her house at the top of Cedar Avenue and watched the town she had watched from behind a counter for 30 years, with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what she contributed and does not need anyone to tell her. Frank Hartwell had died in 1899, and Edna had kept the hotel going with brisk competence and the help of 2 young women from the area, and Dorothy still kept the books, though she came in less often now, and the friendship between her and Edna had settled into the particular comfort of old friendship, the kind where you do not have to explain anything because you were both there. It was the spring of 1906, and Dusk Creek was 24 years past the morning Dorothy Covington had arrived with her broken carpetbag and $1.42, and Dorothy Atkins was sitting on the porch with her coffee in the early morning, the same porch that had looked east toward the sunrise for all these years, and the sunrise was doing exactly what it had always done, flooding the flat golden land with light from the horizon inward, and the horses were moving in the pasture. And Patience the roan had died 3 years ago at the ancient age of 31 and been replaced by a young mare whose name was, because Arthur had named her, Arithmetic, which was either a comment on the breeding records or a private joke, and possibly both. Levi came out with his coffee and sat down beside her, as he had done on every morning that he was here to sit, for 23 years. He was 51 now, and his dark hair was mostly silver, and the lines around his eyes were deep, and she loved every one of them as evidence of all the days they had spent living. "Arthur says the Beaumonts are coming in June," he said. "Ruth wrote that they are," Dorothy said. "Thomas wants to look at the limestone formations near the creek, and Ruth wants to see James." She paused. "She has opinions about his education that she has been saving up since Christmas." "James is 2 years old," Levi said. "Ruth has opinions about educational foundations," Dorothy said. "She comes by it honestly." He looked at her sideways with that same dry warmth that had been making her laugh for more than 20 years. "Does she?" he said. She laughed, and he smiled at the sound of it, and the sun came fully over the horizon and turned everything gold. They sat in the light and the quiet of the morning, the two of them who had found each other at the corner of a general store in the summer of 1882, in a town that was plain and honest and had turned out to be exactly the right place for exactly the right reasons. She thought, as she sometimes did, about the dollar, about the weight of it in her hand and the look in his eyes when he gave it, and the long cold morning at the station when she had stood with her carpetbag and her closed-off heart and made the decision that had made all of this. She had stayed. She had used his last dollar to buy herself back into this life, this town, this man, this morning on this porch in this light. She had never once in 23 years wished it otherwise. "Levi," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that I am aware every single day of how fortunate I am, of how fortunate we are. I do not want it to be one of those things that goes without saying until it has been unsaid too long." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those amber-brown eyes that had watched her through every year of this life they had built, steady and warm and entirely without pretense. "I know," he said. "I feel it too, all of it." He reached over and took her hand as he had taken it on 10,000 mornings and held it in his warm, steady grip. "Dorothy Atkins," he said, and his voice was low and certain and full of everything they had ever been to each other. "You walked into this town with a broken bag and a tired heart, and you made it a place worth being in. You made me a man worth being." He paused. "And you laughed at something I said. I want you to know I have never gotten over any of it." She turned to him and he was looking at her, all of him, nothing held back, and she felt the warmth of it go through her from crown to soul. The same warmth she had felt on the first real morning she had understood what he was and what they might be. The same warmth it had always been, not diminished by familiarity but deepened by it. The way a fire in a good hearth burns hotter for having burned long. She leaned over and kissed him in the morning light on their porch, with the horses moving in the pasture and the last of the stars fading and the enormous sky opening above them, blue and vast and full of what the day was going to bring. And the day brought Arthur coming out from the house with James on his hip, James who was 2 years old and entirely certain of his own importance, and Caroline behind them with her sleeves rolled up and flour on her apron, and the look of someone who has decided today is for cooking, and no argument will be entertained. And the day brought Edna Hartwell, who walked out from town in the late morning to return a book she had borrowed and to stay for coffee and conversation, which was what she usually came for, and which everyone understood was the point. And the day brought a letter from Ruth in Philadelphia with a sketch inside it. She had begun drawing geological formations and had a genuine talent for it, of a limestone arch near the creek here in Texas, drawn from memory, with a note at the bottom that said, "I am always partly there. Tell the porch I said hello." And the day brought Levi in the afternoon, coming back from the stable with his silver-dark hair and his battered hat, and the easy particular way he moved across a piece of ground, and Dorothy watching from the window and still, after all of it, catching her breath slightly. And the evening brought the porch again, and the sunset, and the two of them together in the long gold light, and everything settled and right and whole, the whole of it complete, the past with its difficult roads and its gifts, the present with its fullness, the future with Arthur's plans and Ruth's curiosity and James's loud opinions, and whatever was coming next. Dorothy leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and looked out at the land she had chosen, the land that had chosen her back, and the sky above it that was always as big as it had ever been. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, everything.